The deepest problem in the system described by this transcript is not how Vladimir Putin reached the presidency, but what happens when power is no longer centered on him. In the source's final argument, Putin and his circle fear a divided leadership because they believe rival centers of authority would give Western governments an opening to influence one camp against another. The account compares Putin with Boris Yeltsin and argues that neither man treated surrendering the presidency to a political opponent as a normal personal defeat. Yeltsin is portrayed as using oligarch support to protect Russia's new private property and market order, while Putin is portrayed as using centralized power to protect a recovered sense of Russia's international strength. From that perspective, losing the presidency is interpreted not simply as losing office, but as Russia itself losing control. That is why even a trusted successor can look dangerous in this logic, because formal authority in another person's hands creates a second center of power that cannot be perfectly controlled. Yet the same strategy creates its own limit, because a political system stabilized around one person grows old with that person, and no leader can remain alive or in power forever. The transcript therefore ends with a stark contradiction. Putin can keep postponing succession, but he cannot remove succession from history. That contradiction frames the source's opening scene in March 2024. On March 18, 2024, the transcript says Putin won the Russian presidential election again for a fifth time, opening a path for him to remain in power at least until 2036. It gives his result as 87% of the vote, and places the length of his rule only a few years behind Joseph Stalin, suggesting that a longer life and continued rule could let him pass Stalin's record. In his victory speech, Putin said the result would allow Russia to become more prosperous by becoming stronger and more effective. The transcript reads that message as evidence of a larger belief, that Putin sees himself as the person uniquely suited to keep Russia strong. It also stresses that Russian society has no obvious picture of who would replace him, and suggests that Putin may believe only death can finally end his rule. That leaves the central question of the documentary in place. How did an obscure former intelligence officer become so dominant that the future of the state is discussed through the question of whether he remains at the center of it? To understand that mindset, the story returns to the collapse of the Soviet system. In 1991, the Soviet Union broke apart into multiple independent states, including the Russian Federation, which was led by Boris Yeltsin for roughly 8 years. The transcript describes Yeltsin's government as relying heavily on alliances with the new oligarch class that emerged in post-Soviet Russia. On August 9, 1999, with Yeltsin ill, he suddenly dismissed his prime minister and replaced him with a little-known 46-year-old official named Vladimir Putin. Putin's route to that moment began much earlier, after he completed a law degree in Leningrad in 1975 and entered the KGB. The source describes the KGB as the Soviet intelligence service and says Putin's early work focused on counterintelligence and monitoring foreign nationals. By 1976, he had reached the rank of first lieutenant, and after training at the Andropov Red Banner Institute in Moscow and developing German language skills, he was assigned to Dresden in East Germany. From 1985 until 1990, he worked there under the cover of a translator. The transcript also recounts the later discovery of a Stasi identification card bearing Putin's name, saying it allowed him access to Stasi facilities, while not proving that he carried out espionage missions for the East German service. The most important part of Dresden in this account is what Putin watched happen around him. As communist governments destabilized at the end of the 1980s, the transcript says 2 lasting impressions formed in his mind, beginning with fear of mass revolt. During the 1989 upheaval in East Germany, Putin was still serving in Dresden as crowds filled the streets and the Berlin Wall fell. In the interview collection First Person, he later described asking for help when a crowd threatened a KGB facility in Dresden in December 1989, only to find that Moscow under Mikhail Gorbachev sent no assistance. The source says Putin responded by destroying sensitive documents that he believed could later be used against Russia, burning so much material that, in his telling, the furnace burst us. The second impression was discussed with the vacuum of authority in Moscow as the Soviet Union collapsed. Unable to stop the wider transformation, Putin resigned from the KGB in 1991 and entered politics in his native Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. He worked at City Hall as an advisor to Mayor Anatoly Sobchak on international relations until 1996, and also participated in the political networks of the new Russian state. The source presents this period as the bridge between two worlds. In East Germany, Putin had belonged to an intelligence system that was disappearing, while in post-Soviet Russia, he learned how to survive, build elite relationships, and move upward inside a completely different political order. Putin's national rise accelerated in 1996. When Anatoly Sobchak lost power in St. Petersburg, Putin did not fall with him. Instead, he maintained connections among Russia's new elites and moved to Moscow. Inside the Kremlin, he passed through a rapid sequence of senior posts, including work in the Presidential Property Administration and then the presidential staff. In 1998, Boris Yeltsin appointed him director of the FSB, the security service that succeeded the KGB, and he remained there until August 1999. By the end of that year, Putin was prime minister. Then, on New Year's Eve before 2000, Yeltsin unexpectedly announced his resignation from the presidency. Under the 1993 Russian constitution as described in the transcript, the prime minister would become acting president and a presidential election would be held within 3 months. That meant the little-known prime minister automatically moved into the highest office. The source says Yeltsin had already come to see Putin as an exceptional candidate to succeed him, but constitutional succession alone did not explain why the public began to accept him so quickly. The war in Chechnya gave Putin the stage on which his national image changed. The transcript says he repeatedly appeared on television, blamed Chechen groups for bombings of Russian buildings, and projected the message that Russia's interests came before everything else. His hard line against the rebellion helped create a heroic and patriotic image, and his popularity rose sharply. At the same time, the source says he was still widely viewed as a liberal and a Democrat who might continue market reforms. He also received support from figures inside Yeltsin's oligarchic circle, including Boris Berezovsky, whose backing helped smooth Putin's transition into the acting presidency. Putin did not formally join the New Unity Party, but he cultivated groups that still possessed influence and a mass following. By the presidential election of March 26, 2000, he had become the dominant candidate and won in a single round with 53% of the vote. On May 7, 2000, Vladimir Putin was inaugurated as Russia's elected president. The oligarchs who had helped him rise appear in the transcript to have made a critical misjudgment. Some believed the man who had arrived from outside the most famous political circles could be shaped. But within only a few months of taking office, Putin began asserting control over independent media. The source describes television outlets being closed or raided, and news coverage becoming increasingly filtered by the state, an early sign of the governing style he would build. Putin also understood that political authority in Russia could not be separated from the enormous private fortunes created during the 1990s. After the Soviet collapse, Yeltsin's privatization of major industries, from energy to mineral resources, had allowed businessmen to acquire immense wealth and influence. Those fortunes did not remain in the economic sphere. Oligarchs became powerful enough to influence government policy itself. Putin saw that kind of independent power as a restriction on his own freedom of action. So he did not abolish the oligarchic system, but he began changing the terms on which its members could remain rich and politically safe. Putin's message to the oligarchs was simple in the transcript's telling. Stay out of politics, do not challenge the presidency, and the state will largely leave your businesses alone. The bargain was difficult to enforce because extreme wealth created political leverage, and several powerful businessmen tested the boundary. Boris Berezovsky and Vladimir Gusinsky used their media holdings to criticize Putin's policies in Chechnya. The source says their outlets were brought under pressure and that Gusinsky faced a tax evasion case. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of Russia's richest men and once the owner of 78% of the oil company Yukos, became an even more visible critic and accused Putin of corruption. When the state found an opening, Khodorkovsky was arrested and ultimately sentenced to 10 years in prison on fraud and tax evasion charges. The transcript presents these cases as a warning that other outspoken oligarchs understood, and it says a number of them chose to leave Russia to protect themselves and their companies. Soon after Putin took office, another crisis tested the new government in a very different way. The Kursk submarine sank after explosions during a naval exercise in the Barents Sea, killing almost all of its 118 crew members. The source says 23 sailors initially survived inside the vessel, but Russia rejected foreign rescue assistance for days, and the men later died. Boris Kuznetsov, a lawyer representing families of lost sailors, is quoted in the transcript as arguing that the weakening of democratic institutions and growing state interference began around the Kursk disaster. The following years brought terrorist attacks that reinforced Putin's image as a leader willing to take extreme risks in the name of the state. During the Dubrovka theater hostage crisis in Moscow, armed Chechen militants held civilians inside the building, and Russian forces ended the siege by pumping gas into the theater before storming it. The transcript gives a death toll of 41 attackers and at least 129 hostages, while describing roughly 170 deaths around the crisis overall. The operation drew controversy because the method used to end the siege also killed many captives. Yet the source says much of the public still saw Putin as a leader prepared to make hard decisions. It also notes that United States President George W. Bush supported Putin's response and placed responsibility for civilian deaths on the terrorists. Another catastrophe followed on September 1, 2004, when armed extremists seized School No. 1 in Beslan, North Ossetia, demanding a Russian withdrawal from Chechnya and recognition of separatist independence. The transcript says more than 300 people died after Russian forces assaulted the building, including 186 children, and that only one hostage taker, Nurpashikulaev, was captured alive and later sentenced to life imprisonment. Russia was criticized for refusing negotiations and for the way the rescue unfolded, and the European Court of Human Rights later ruled, according to the source, that Russia had failed in its handling of the crisis. Economic advisor Andrei Larionov eventually resigned and publicly argued that Russia had changed so radically that it could no longer be described as a free country. Even so, Putin's nationalist image remained politically powerful, and in the 2004 presidential election, he won another term with 71% of the vote. Behind the elections, the transcript describes an increasingly organized network of wealth and security around Putin. One circle consisted of associates from St. Petersburg, including Gennady Timchenko in energy trading, the brothers Arkady and Boris Rotenberg in large infrastructure projects, and Yuri Kovalchuk, who was described as so close to Putin that critics called him the president's personal banker. A second circle came from the intelligence, police, and military establishment, the Siloviki, whose members gained opportunities under Putin that the source says they had lacked under Yeltsin. Igor Sechin, later chief executive of the oil giant Rosneft, is presented as a leading example of this security-linked elite. A third group consisted of older businessmen who did not have the same personal history with Putin, but had accumulated wealth in the 1990s. Figures such as Vladimir Putin and Oleg Deripaska could remain inside the system as long as they did not become direct political threats. The transcript also alleges reciprocal relationships between the state and organized crime networks, describing criminal groups as being allowed to operate illegal businesses in exchange for services useful to power. It cites a 2018 Spanish money laundering case involving 18 Russians and mentions Vladislav Resnik as a figure alleged to have links with Russian mafia networks. These claims are presented by the source as another layer in a system where independent centers of power were not necessarily destroyed, but were expected to remain loyal or useful. Putin's early relationship with the United States did not begin as open confrontation. The transcript notes that he was among the first foreign leaders to call President George W. Bush after the September 11 attacks, and that Russia assisted the American campaign that followed in Afghanistan. Bush later recalled looking into Putin's eyes and seeing a direct and trustworthy man. That brief warmth deteriorated as relations with Britain and the wider West worsened. Former KGB officer and Kremlin critic Alexander Litvinenko died in London after exposure to radioactive polonium-210, and the transcript recounts a British inquiry that concluded Putin may have approved the operation. By the Munich Security Conference in 2007, Putin was publicly attacking the scale of American power and accusing the United States of exceeding its national borders in almost every sphere. He was also angered by plans for missile defense systems in Central Europe and warned that, although pieces of the Berlin Wall had become souvenirs, new dividing lines and new walls were being built. The message was no longer only rhetorical. In 2008, Russian forces defeated the Georgian military and moved into the separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, demonstrating that Putin was willing to use military force against governments aligned with the West in the former Soviet space. The 2008 war with Georgia was described by the transcript as intensely personal for Putin because Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili was strongly pro-NATO. Yet the same year that Russia demonstrated military power abroad, Putin faced a constitutional limit at home. Russian rules barred him from serving a third consecutive presidential term, so the question was whether a leader at the height of his popularity would truly leave the center of power. In December 2007, 3 months before the election, Putin publicly endorsed Dmitry Medvedev, a trusted associate of more than 17 years, as his successor. He had already elevated Medvedev in 2005 by making him first deputy prime minister. Backed by United Russia, Medvedev won the election and became president on May 7, 2008. His first major political move was to appoint Putin as prime minister, keeping Putin at the top of Russia's governing structure, even though he no longer held the presidency. 5 months later, on November 5, Medvedev proposed extending presidential terms from 4 years to 6, and terms in the State Duma from 4 years to 5. The State Duma approved the amendment by a vote the transcript gives as 388 to 58. In 2009, Medvedev also proposed changing the mechanism for selecting senior judges so that the president would nominate them with Duma approval. Because the longer presidential term would not apply to Medvedev's current term, the transcript asks who would benefit from the change and answers that the obvious beneficiary was Putin. By September 2011, the arrangement was no longer a secret. Medvedev and Putin announced that Putin would return as the presidential candidate, while Medvedev stepped aside. In the 2012 election, Putin returned to the Kremlin with 63.6% of the vote. The source presents the Medvedev years not as a genuine withdrawal from power, but as a temporary constitutional maneuver that allowed Putin to obey the letter of the consecutive term limit while preserving decisive influence. Even during his time as prime minister, however, older accusations and political challenges resurfaced. A 1992 metal export corruption allegation worth $3 million was raised again by Marina Salih, a senior St. Petersburg politician associated with Putin's earlier career. The transcript says the accusation was dismissed when reviewed, and that Salih, rather than Putin, later left St. Petersburg for a remote area because she felt threatened by Putin's political power. The account then broadens into a darker pattern, saying that during years of growing criticism, a number of Putin's opponents disappeared from public life through death, imprisonment, or psychiatric confinement. It acknowledges that the exact reasons behind these cases were not always known, while presenting a theory that fear itself became a political message to other challengers. By December 2011, discontent had moved from elite criticism into the streets, so tens of thousands of people gathered in Moscow, with demonstrations reported in 38 Russian cities after allegations of fraud in parliamentary elections involving Putin's United Russia Party. Police estimated the Moscow crowd at around 25,000, while organizers said it was roughly twice that size. The government calculated that suppressing every gathering immediately could be more dangerous than allowing some demonstrations to proceed. The protests showed that the carefully managed transfer between Putin and Medvedev had not removed political pressure. Instead, the prospect of Putin's return made the question of who truly held power impossible to ignore. One of the most visible figures emerging from that opposition movement was Alexei Navalny, and the next phase of the story would show what challenging the system could cost. Alexei Navalny became one of the central organizers and symbols of the protest movement. The transcript says the government recognized the threat he represented, increased surveillance around him, and in 2013 secured a 5-year prison sentence against him on an embezzlement charge. Thousands protested that sentence in July 2013. The demonstrations from 2011 through 2013, often associated with the Bolotnaya movement, are presented in the source as the peak of public anger over electoral manipulation, democratic decline, and pressure on journalists and political opponents. Putin in turn is described as viewing the demonstrations as a vehicle through which Western governments could weaken Russia. For a period he experimented with the language of liberalization, speaking about political decentralization, greater economic freedom for regions, and reform. The transcript says that language faded once the immediate threat passed. It then portrays the government as systematically reducing the space available to opposition through election manipulation, harsh prosecutions, imprisonment, political pressure, and in some cases killings or poisonings that critics associated with the regime. Navalny himself called his prosecution politically motivated. The source makes clear that his case was only one part of a much larger struggle over whether independent political and civic organizations could survive outside the structure controlled by the Kremlin. The death of investigative journalist Anna Politkovskaya became one of the most internationally visible examples in that struggle. On October 7, 2006, Putin's birthday, Politkovskaya was found shot in her apartment building. She had reported on the Second Chechen War and the Moscow theater crisis for Novaya Gazeta. 5 men were convicted in connection with her murder, but the transcript says it remained unclear who ordered or financed the killing. Her death intensified criticism that the Russian state was failing to protect independent media, and the source cites the Committee to Protect Journalists as recording 20 murdered journalists and 63 attacks on reporters between 2006 and October 2016. Media control was not limited to physical danger. The transcript says that after Putin disliked NTV's coverage of the Moscow theater hostage crisis, the channel's management was replaced in January 2003, and its reporting quickly became more favorable to him. Controlling television, in the source's argument, served 2 purposes. It removed powerful critics from influential positions, and it allowed the Kremlin to shape public narratives about Chechnya, terrorism, national greatness, and the identity of the state's enemies. Of roughly 3,000 television stations in Russia, the transcript says most avoided serious political reporting, and those that did report politics worked inside increasingly strict limits. The result was that many citizens, especially far from the major cities, encountered a version of Putin and Russia filtered through the system he controlled. The transcript then lists a series of dramatic cases involving Kremlin critics and former insiders. Alexander Litvinenko, a former KGB officer who investigated Politkovskaya's death, died in London on November 23, 2006 after polonium-210 was placed in his tea. Opposition politician Boris Nemtsov was shot and killed on February 27, 2015, on a bridge near the Kremlin. Russian authorities investigated Chechen militants, while his daughter, Jana Nemtsova, publicly held Putin politically responsible for the environment surrounding the murder. Nemtsov had been a strong opponent of Putin and was trying to expose what the source describes as Russia's secret military campaign in eastern Ukraine. On March 4, 2018, former Russian intelligence officer Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were poisoned but survived and later recovered outside Russia. In 2023, Wagner mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin died in a plane crash several months after a rebellion against Putin's authority. The transcript places these episodes beside laws against extremism, control of the cybersphere and mass media, politically charged court cases, and propaganda that labels opponents as traitors. It presents the combined effect as a system that can weaken opposition, not only by removing leaders, but also by persuading part of the public that opposition itself is disloyal to the country. That image of Russia could look very different when the state chose to present itself to the outside world. During the 2018 World Cup, the transcript says Russia received widespread praise as a host. FIFA President Gianni Infantino called it the best World Cup ever, while BBC journalist Steve Rosenberg wrote that Russia appeared warm and friendly, in a way that sharply contrasted with its authoritarian reputation, and that foreign fans he spoke with were surprised. 2 years later, in January 2020, Putin proposed a referendum on constitutional amendments. One of the central changes reset the practical path for him to seek the presidency again in 2024, drawing protests in Moscow and denunciations from anti-Kremlin opposition figures who called the process an illegal constitutional coup. The amendment package also emphasized the priority of Russian law over international norms, prohibited same-sex marriage, and referred to belief in God as a core value. The transcript describes an intensive turnout campaign that included prize incentives, paid celebrity endorsements, and pressure on public sector workers such as doctors and teachers. During the coronavirus epidemic, voting rules were loosened so people could vote from home, at work, and in Moscow and St. Petersburg online. Nearly 78% of voters approved the amendments, according to the source. Parliament had already passed the changes into law, so the referendum was largely symbolic. But it gave the Kremlin a claim of public legitimacy. By that point, Putin was not the world's longest-serving non-royal political leader. The transcript places him at number 21 and begins comparing his tenure with leaders in other former Soviet states. The comparison continues with Tajikistan's Emomali Rahmon, president since 1992, and Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, in power since July 1994. Putin's tenure was shorter than theirs, but the transcript argues that 24 years is still an extraordinary span in a country that formally uses electoral democracy to choose political leaders. It emphasizes that Putin governs Russia, the former imperial center that once dominated those neighboring Soviet republics. During those decades, the source says he revived an old idea of collecting Russian lands, a historical concept used to justify expansion toward territories seen as naturally connected to Russia. That helps explain why Crimea and other regions close to Russia carry such weight in the transcript's interpretation of Putin's strategy. Crimea is described as the most dramatic seizure, but not the only example of Russian intervention in the former Soviet space. Georgia had already shown the pattern. In Syria, the transcript says Putin exploited an opening created by war to display Russian power by supporting Bashar al-Assad's forces. That intervention served several purposes in the source's account: preventing any one rival from dominating a vital part of the Middle East, testing new weapons and military tactics, and signaling to old partners that Russia would not abandon a long-standing ally. Ukraine offered an even larger opening. After the February 2014 revolution created a temporary vacuum of power, the transcript says Putin moved quickly and achieved his greatest territorial demonstration of strength by taking control of neighboring land while the world failed to stop him. His later invasion of Ukraine also triggered demonstrations inside Russia and brought European economic pressure. Yet, the source says the Russian economy was estimated by the IMF to grow by 2.6%, even as prices rose. It argues that Putin understood a particular Russian fear inherited from the Soviet past. Inflation is painful, but empty shelves and shortages can feel more frightening because they recall an older national trauma. As the war failed to deliver a quick victory, Putin increasingly framed it not as a conflict only with Ukraine, but as a struggle against the West. According to the transcript, that framing allowed some Russians to see their country not as fighting a smaller neighbor. In an annual address dated February 29, 2023 in the source, Putin warned Western states not to send troops to Ukraine and said Russia needed stronger defenses after Sweden and Finland joined NATO. The account argues that the regime repeatedly turns events into questions of national perspective and pride. Some observers cited by the source, including Arkady Ostrovsky, see Putin's style as the construction of a modern Tsar who stands above ordinary parties. Another intelligence observer compares Putin's politics to judo, his favorite martial art. Even when physically weaker, a fighter can exploit an opponent's imbalance and move at the moment the opponent is distracted. The transcript uses that analogy to describe Putin's skill at detecting openings created by other governments' hesitation or internal weakness. By 2024, it says he effectively faced two choices: transfer authority to a successor fully under his control, or become his own successor and remain president. His reading of Russian history made the second option look safer. That reading of history begins with perestroika. The transcript says Putin wants above all to avoid a second version of the political, economic, and social restructuring that transformed the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He fears that leaving power could open a process that would again dismantle the state he is trying to preserve. As a former Soviet bureaucrat and intelligence officer, he experienced directly how quickly a superpower could collapse between 1985 and 1991. Yet the source distinguishes his view from the hardest line Soviet nostalgia. It does not portray Putin as believing that Mikhail Gorbachev secretly conspired with the West to destroy the Soviet Union. Instead, it says Putin appears to blame Gorbachev for failing to protect the state's core institutions when crisis arrived. In this interpretation, the disaster was not only one leader's mistake, but a wider failure of collective leadership at the end of the Soviet period. Gorbachev became impatient with the condition of the country and pursued bold political reforms under glasnost or openness. In 1989, he created the Congress of People's Deputies, the Soviet Union's first elected parliament, partly to weaken the Communist Party's grip and advance reform. But the process accelerated beyond the control of Gorbachev and his team. The transcript describes it like a vehicle moving into unknown territory at extreme speed until its drivers lost control and the Soviet Union itself crashed. For Putin, the lesson is not that reform is impossible, but that opening institutions without maintaining command can produce consequences no leader can reverse. Putin already had one personal experiment with giving the presidency to someone else. In 2008, he accepted the constitutional term limit, allowed his advisor and friend, Dmitry Medvedev, to become president, and moved into the prime minister's office. The transcript says the tandem between 2008 and 2012 was uncomfortable because its real guarantees were informal rather than constitutional. Medvedev remained loyal, but as president he formally possessed the authority to dismiss Putin as prime minister. The deeper problem appeared as Medvedev's term approached its end, and a decision had to be made about who would occupy the Kremlin in 2012. People who joined the Moscow street protests of 2011 and 2012 described them as an explosion of anger at Putin's decision to return. Putin and his inner circle, according to the source, interpreted the same protests in the opposite way, as the consequence of having surrendered too much power and allowing the elite to split into two camps, one favoring Medvedev and the other demanding Putin's return. That was the dangerous condition of dual power. Medvedev also became increasingly comfortable exercising real presidential prerogatives, building his own Kremlin team and taking independent decisions. The transcript rejects the idea that he was only a puppet and points to foreign policy as evidence. In 2011, Medvedev chose to abstain on a key United Nations Security Council resolution that allowed Western military action against Libya and Muammar Gaddafi. Putin was furious. Western leaders also openly approached Medvedev, as a more progressive alternative to Putin, reinforcing the fear inside Putin's circle that a split at the top could be exploited from outside. From that experience, the transcript says Putin and his allies concluded that dual power could allow Western governments to court a reformist wing of the Russian elite while isolating a conservative wing around Putin. The account then returns to the continuity between Yeltsin and Putin. It argues that neither regime was driven by a rigid ideology on a simple left-right spectrum. Both were driven above all by the need to remain in power and prevent opponents from taking the presidency. Yeltsin relied on oligarchs to defend the new capitalist order of private property and markets. Putin, by contrast, is portrayed as using concentrated authority to defend Russia's recovered international power after what the source describes as the damage of the 1990s. Yeltsin remained closer than Putin to Western standards of democracy and political freedom, but for both men, the transcript says a presidential defeat to an adversary would be interpreted as a defeat for Russia rather than a routine transfer of office. That makes even a trusted successor risky. In this logic, handing the presidency to Medvedev in 2012 or to another loyal figure in 2024 could create an opening for Western manipulation once the successor held real constitutional authority. Putin's answer has been to keep postponing that risk by keeping the center of power in his own hands. But the answer cannot be permanent. The system grows older as Putin grows older, and the source ends by stating the one limit no political mechanism can remove: death. A structure stabilized around one person cannot live forever. So when that person's rule ends, the power, legitimacy, and legacy built around him face their most difficult test.